This is Duke University.
For more than 20 years, journalist Joan Morgan has been one of the leading voices in terms of Black feminist thought in the United States and in the Caribbean. Now she's working on a new project, thinking about the pleasure principle and the smell of desire. Joan Morgan joins us to talk about her new line, Emily Jane, and raising the question about whether or not you have tapped into your inner winch. And we're also joined by Professor Andreana Clay, who talks about her new book, The Hip Hop Generation Fights Back. My name is Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Good afternoon and welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we are joined this afternoon via Skype from her office at New York University with Joan Morgan, veteran cultural critic and journalist, author of the legendary When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, My Life as a Hip-Hop Feminist, third-year graduate student in the Department of American Studies at New York University, and as if you don't know already, she is the forever BFF. How are you doing today, Joan?
I'm good, Mark. How are you?
And so in the midst of this 20-year journalism career, you make this transition into a PhD program in American Studies to do that thing. And while you're just kind of working through and preparing for your exams, you come up with an idea. You want to start a business of body butters and fragrances. So talk to us a little bit about Emily Jane.
You know, okay, so I have a business where I produce body butters and natural fragrances by hand in my Manhattan studio in the size of an apartment where most people in New York City don't eat. They use or cook rather, they use their ovens to store clothing. I'm actually producing a full body care line. So it's a little insane and crazy, but really I had gotten to a point in grad school where I realized I wasn't doing anything creative. I injured my back, so I haven't been dancing. You know, I haven't been doing any journalistic writing since I started school. And so I really felt the need to do something tactile, hands-on. And then my son had eczema, and so nothing over the counter was working. And so I was like, let me just whip up a little shea butter and olive oil. And you know, as the child of a product junkie, which I have to admit that I am, I have a son with very particular taste. So it has to smell a certain way. It has to feel a certain way. And so he kept sending me back to the drawing board, and I kept coming up with things. And people kept touching me. You know, they wanted to know what I had on my skin or what I was using. And enough people asked me if I would make them some that I said, okay, I guess I would sell it. But in my defense, I thought it was like Joan, you know, just Joan, private citizen Joan, selling a couple body butters to her friends. I just wasn't ready for what happened when Joan Morgan, writer, public person, decided to sell body butters. So that's kind of why it looks like this big, crazy, wonderful, explosive thing.
Talk a little bit about the name Emily Jane. It's not accidental, right? You're doing some interesting kind of historical labor with that title.
Yeah, you know, a lot of my work in graduate school is about Caribbean American identity and what it means to be second generation Black Caribbean American in living in America. And what does that mean? How do we fight against certain kinds of erasure that come about unintentionally almost when you conflate the terms Black and African American, who gets erased in the historical narrative. Like before I went to grad school, I just had this moment where I realized I was really fluent as a cultural critic about American racial history and American racial politics. And I had this aching, horrible realization that I knew very, very little about Jamaica's actual history. And, you know, I knew that there were Jamaicans who were very significant in African American history, Claude McKay, Marcus Garvey, but I only knew those things because I kind of made them my business to know it. And I realized that I would actually have to go through this process of learning what that meant to be Caribbean American. And so, you know, for me, this line, Emily is my maternal grandmother, Jane is my maternal great-grandmother. And the line is based on my kind of scent memories of the Caribbean, because I didn't grow up in Jamaica, as you know. So I kind of harvest memories through the way things smell and feel and taste. And so those scents, those memories are the things that drive the way or inform the way that Emily Jane has produced the kind of scents that people smell there are not things that are typical that you would smell here. So they're really based on the Caribbean.
We're here with Joan Morgan, a legendary cultural critic and journalist, author of the groundbreaking book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, My Life as a Hip Hop Feminist, and we're talking about her brand new venture, Emily Jane, her line of body butters and natural fragrances. You talk about these scent memories, and again, when you unpack this whole notion of what it means to be Caribbean American within the context of what is really the hegemony of African Americanness. Whether we're talking here in the United States, but even the way African Americanness kind of travels around the globe. Talk a little bit about the contrast between those kind of scent memories that you might have with the Caribbean to the kind of scent memories you have of say, growing up in the Bronx or as a young adult living in Brooklyn and those kind of dynamics.
Yeah. One of the things that I think being a New Yorker, a Caribbean New Yorker, which is sort of unique to New York. You can probably experience this also in Miami, but it's very possible to be extremely Jamaican and live in New York City, in the sense that, like, I'm the only family member that doesn't still live in the Bronx.
Yeah.
So I grew up in very real ways, bicultural. The food I ate was different. My house was different. The music was different. The lilt of the language is the same, but of course patois is different. It has a different rhythm. It has a different pacing. So, I have friends who would come over to my parents' house and not understand a word that we were saying when it was let loose. So in many ways, I did grow up bicultural. To me, the thing that becomes very, very, Heavy used to say that, like his entire sense of being Jamaican really comes from like living and growing up in Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
Believe it or not. Yeah. The Jamaican part of the identity is something we both talk about, going back on island and cultivating over periods of time, like building friendships with people, like sustaining family ties there. Like, I happen to be lucky enough to have had homes in Jamaica, but the sense of a Jamaican American identity for me really exists in the tension between occupying those two spaces as opposed to just one space. So things don't necessarily always hit. Something might hit me as distinctly Caribbean, but it won't necessarily hit me as distinctly American in terms of my memories, because there was never a time in the Bronx or Brooklyn where there wasn't a Jamaican American thing going on.
Okay. And so for a moment, cards on the table, I am a loyal user of Emily Jane. and I remember when I made my first couple of purchases and wanting to ask, which one is the male scent and which one is a female scent. And you very deliberately decided not to create scents that were gendered in that way. Talk a little bit about that decision.
Well, for me, it would never have dawned on me to make male scents or female scents. Just in terms of my own personal usage, I've always just used colognes or perfumes or fragrances that I like. So if I smell it on a brother and I like it, and I like the way it translates on me, I have no problem buying it for myself. But beyond that, I create scent really from a very deep space of pleasure. What I'm trying to elicit is that kind of gut reaction from you when you smell it, that like your eyes are rolling in the back of your head, or you just you stop dead in your track. And to me, that's not a gendered thing, The scents smell differently on men than they do on women, but they smell differently on every single person who tries them on, because they're based from essential oils, so they react very specifically with your own body chemistry. But it would never dawn on me to say sandalwood is the scent for the guys, and wench is the scent for the women. The prototype for wench, believe it or not, I tested repeatedly on a male friend of mine before I started testing it on women.
So let's talk about wench. You name one of your fragrances wench, and that's not something that gets kind of put out there and people ignore. I mean, there has been a response to naming one of your fragrances wench. So talk a little bit about the inspiration for wench, but also talk about navigating the critical response to it.
Well, wench came about because honestly, I needed something that was more floral, and I'm not a floral girl. Like, I like flowers, but in terms of creating a floral scent, what's considered a girly scent, that's a bit of a challenge for me. So I wanted to start with something romantic, and I ended up, I ended up in the French Quarter in like the 19th century. The French Quarter to me in New Orleans is an extension of the Caribbean in terms of how I think of the Caribbean. So I was really walking through the French Quarter about 2 a.m. in the morning, and I ran smack into some night blooming jasmine. And I wanted that, 2 a.m. in the morning, the French Quarter is a very kind of, you're trapped in time. It's almost kind of haunted place. And that jasmine, no matter how I walked back and forth on that block, I couldn't pinpoint where it was. Yeah. And so I wanted a scent that kind of encapsulated that experience. So of course, I thought of a bordello because that's who I am. And I thought of a madam as opposed to, a maiden because that's just kind of who I am. And so I very playfully, had it out on Facebook, and I said, I should call it wench, but I was joking. And the response from my female friends was so insane. They were like, when are you going to put out wench? When are you going to put out wench? So, we did that. Now, some people thought that was fantastic. I got a Facebook message from someone the other day who said that they wanted to be compensated for their psychic pain, that given the term wench, that they hoped that I was giving every cent of my proceeds over to a domestic violence agency, and that I must be completely unaware of the history of the word to assign it to a beauty product. But, here's the thing. One of my favorite thinkers that I've encountered since I've been in grad school has been David Scott. And David Scott does this work about narratives and how we perceive narratives. Do we perceive them as narratives of tragedy, or do we perceive them of narratives of uplift? And they're the same narrative, but given the way that we frame them, really reveals the potential for what we can do with them. So for me, yes, I understand that there is a narrative about wench and the bodies of Black women that's very much linked to slavery. But I also know that there are, wherever there is a narrative, that there are really multiple narratives. Right. And so, I had a great conversation with Patrice Yersick from Afabella, who talked about her own great-grandmother traveling from Venezuela and working as a courtesan, which they called wenches, in Trinidad. So that's part of her family history. A different narrative about economy and power and freedom, all existing within this space of slavery or immediate post-slavery and Black women's bodies. And then even for myself, my mom was sitting around at the apartment, and I don't mark anything in the apartment because I kind of know what everything is. And so she starts playing with the scent, and she's like, "Oh my God, what is this?" And I smell, and I go, "Oh, Mom, that's wench." And she kind of looks at me like, "You named a scent wench?" And I go, "Mom, you know how I am." And she's laughing hysterically, Mark. And I'm like, "Okay, so what's up with this?" And she says to me that my great-grandmother, who is the Jane of Emily Jane, whenever she got ready to cuss somebody out, she would call them a dirty wench. That was like her favorite expletive. And what amazed my mother is that she's never used that word with me. I never knew that story. So there is clearly something in my just historical and ancestral memory that tapped into. And for us, whatever pain my mother might have felt, the fact that Jane used that word. Now, Jane was the daughter of a slave. Okay. So wench clearly meant something for her, that she used the word as an expletive. Whatever my mother's reasons for never using the word with me, or any pain that she may have felt around it, that is not what she's feeling now, because wench is her favorite scent in the line. And she called me up the other day to say she put it on and put on a bright red dress. and took herself to the church fair. I was like, what have we unleashed here? My own family, there are these complicated sense of narratives. So whatever the original story may be, the idea that there are black and brown bodies from Manhattan to Mozambique now wearing wench, loving their skin, loving the way that they feel, feeling sexy is really important to me. And I'm not saying that that completely erases the narrative, but I think it's an important addition to the narrative.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined by writer and critic and third-year graduate student Joan Morgan, talking about her new venture, Emily Jane, a line of body butters and natural fragrances. You know, folks get into graduate school and they get deep into this kind of process, and you want to kind of like a break from the work. But in some ways, the work that you're doing with Emily Jane is not really separate and distinct from the work. It really is kind of an intersection of interesting kind of space of talking about black bodies and this concept that you call the pleasure principle. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about the pleasure principle as it relates to your work, but also in terms of some of the things that you're trying to do with Emily Jane.
Okay. You know, I am unashamedly hedonist by nature. I believe that that hedonism for feminists is good, and something that we should actually, you know, there's this belief, one of my professors, Efran White, who I adore, says to me, you know, Joan, feminists are kind of allergic to pleasure. And I think that that's really an important place to start from, because I think a politics of pleasure, particularly for black feminists and brown feminists, is so incredibly important. Our sexuality is often written about in a way that it's historically problematized for obvious reasons. But what we're less good at and have been less successful at is actually developing a language for pleasure, and to assert the right to pleasure. So for me, you know, creating a product that is deeply, you know, that is deeply, deeply steeped in my own need to have a very kind of tactile relationship with my feminism, with the women that I love and I do this work for and about, and to know that we are touching ourselves, because touch is such a problematic area for us. You know, I spoke at the Black Women's Health Conference at Tulane a year ago, and the doctors there offer free massages for their clientele, much of which is black and female, and the women never took them up on it. And it was because after, you know, really talking to women, the idea of non-sexualized touch was really foreign, even when the masseuse was same-sex. So, you know, I think that this idea of looking at our skin and touching our skin, and, you know, I'm really proud of the way that Emily Jane looks on our skin. Like, one of the things that happens is you put it on and this beautiful brown skin just starts to, like, glisten. You know?
Shiny Negroes.
Shiny, happy Negroes. To be, you know, helping to produce shiny, happy Negroes that are loving the skin that we, and particularly for women in an industry that's so oppressive. Like, you know, the way that beauty products sell in America is to start from a place of lack, to tell you are missing something. So the language on the site is very deliberate in that I don't ever try to sell you on anti-aging or fight wrinkles or any of that other crap. You know, I want to start from wherever you are and hopefully allow you to just experience something that makes you feel good. And yeah, that's definitely about commerce, but it's very, very much steeped in a politics of pleasure and a right to pleasure.
Have you been surprised at all by the reaction to it? You know, whether it's going to be, you know, Emily Jane in Essence Magazine or interviews at Madame Noir, Crunk Feminist Collective have given you multiple shout outs. Have you been surprised by the reaction of folks to it so far?
You know, I am surprised at how quickly things are moving. I literally formed this company in July. My first sale was the last week of June. The website went up in August. By October, we were I say we as if there's more than me and Emily Jane, but in October, we had commitments from 3 national magazines and 3 major blogs in terms of the audience of Black women. So in a sense, I am really surprised about how quickly it's moving. I do believe, I mean, I produce this product because I love it. And so I think that, with all my theorizations of being a feminist or my positions on politics, if the butter wasn't good, then like whatever, like it doesn't really matter. But in a sense, I'm not surprised because I have worked, Essence was an incredible training ground for understanding Black women's needs, the way that marketing, language that we respond to, language that serves to make us feel better about ourselves, and language that tends to not make us so good about ourselves. And I realized that I have been working in these sort of tangential fields concerning Black women, whether it be journalism or beauty or entertainment, for 20 years. So I literally kind of had this treasure chest of information that I didn't really know because it had never been pulled together for me in this particular way. So when I unleashed it, it was just kind of like I'm amazed at how much I just sort of knew how to do.
You've been watching Left of Black. We're here with Joan Morgan. I could list the resume, starting with one of the founding contributors to Vibe magazine, former managing editor of Essence magazine, of course, the book that everyone still talks about when chicken heads come home to roost, My Life as a Hip Hop Feminist. On my side, of course, the forever BFF, Bronx Girl, 1231 Fulton Avenue, shout out. And it's been so great talking to you about your new venture, Emily Jane, and we look forward to a lot more stuff around it in the future.
Thank you, Mark.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Andreana Clay, Associate Professor of Sociology at San Francisco State University and the author of the new book, The Hip Hop Generation Fights Back, Youth, Activism, and Post-Civil Rights. That's New York University Press. How are you doing today, Professor Clay?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
So let me start with the title of the book, right? Because there are some folks who are going to see the words hip hop and youth and activism and think, well, those things don't go together, right? And then you throw civil rights into the mix. And there's a popular thought that somehow the last activist generation somehow died off, with the civil rights generation. You're making a very different kind of argument, right? You're suggesting that there are, in fact, traditions of activism that we see amongst American youth, and hip hop is the thing that brings them together. Talk a little bit about your inspiration for the book.
Well, the inspiration really was when I moved to Oakland. I started working in youth organizations, both as a volunteer and then eventually as a researcher and sometimes as a staff member, and really just seeing what the young people were doing, like in a place like Oakland that has such a rich political history, where many of the social movements and civil rights activism that we have in our minds, and specifically the people that we have in our minds, were here in Oakland or in the Bay Area. And to see what the young people would do with those images and with that discourse around civil rights and activism and in the Bay Area was really sort of what propelled me to thinking about this generation and what they do with this discourse.
And I mean, talk a little bit about this Bay Area tradition, right? We know that the Panthers come out of there and a range of other folks. I think what was most striking about the last year around the Occupy movement is that there was just a different kind of energy, coming out of Occupy Oakland or Occupy Berkeley that we didn't see, in other places around the country. Talk a little bit about that tradition for folks in our audience that, really aren't aware of this very distinct political and activist tradition in the Bay Area.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's particular. I mean, the first thing that we think about, I think, is the Black Panthers, like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown, and people that were actually in Oakland, people who ran for city council in Oakland, that like sort of make up the fabric of the political history here. So there's like the Black Panthers on one side, but also the student organizing, like at San Francisco State with the Third World Strike in '68, and how that really informs not only the College of Ethnic Studies at State, but sort of the identities of the people that go through those different programs.
Right, the birth of Black
ethnic
studies
at Berkeley, like right. That history really informs the people that are organizing in something like Occupy Oakland or Occupy Berkeley.
Talk about hip hop within this context, and this might sound like a strange question, but is it really this kind of generational political activism that's driving hip hop in this context? Or is there something innate about hip hop that is driving some of these folks together to engage amongst activist activities? Or is it a little both?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it might be a little of both, but I think the thing about hip hop is, in particular for Black and Latino and some Asian youth in urban areas, is that it really becomes a tool or a vehicle to really address like the racism, the classism, the sometimes heterosexism and sexism that's directed at these young people and the stories that we tell about these particular young people and who they are. And hip hop has always been that sort of voice to, I guess, fight back or push back against that, in that it's really the language that people use to contradict some of those images. Sometimes confirm those images, but really as a tool to contradict them.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Andreana Clay, who's an Associate Professor of Sociology at San Francisco State University. She's the author of the brand new book, The Hip Hop Generation Fights Back, Youth Activism and Post-Civil Rights, published by New York University Press. We share the same editor, and Eric Zinner. So let's give Eric a quick shout out. Going back to this notion of kind of youth activism, you raised in one of the questions that, you know, this kind of transcends the normal kind of activism we see around issues of race, right? We also see a kind of very specific gender critique, but also a queer critique. Talk what it looks like in the Bay Area when young activists kind of coalesce around hip hop, but also anti-homophobic politics.
Yeah, I should just mention that my editor is Eileen Kalish.
Oh, my bad. My bad.
No problem. Yeah, I think, well, I was really surprised when I was working in these organizations. Like, I wasn't really surprised that people were using hip hop, but like that young people, and particularly young people of color who are absent from any discourse around LGBT rights or LGBT identity, even until recently, or if we talk about it in terms of risk. But like the young people of color, one of their central platforms for these workshops that they were doing in different high schools and middle schools and elementary schools around the Bay Area was looking at homophobia. And this was something that they came up with on their own, both straight and some of the LGBT youth, but it's something that really shapes their experience. It's something that they wanted to organize around. And I think hip hop fits into that, again, because of the intersections around race and class for this particular group of young people. So I don't think there's a way to really step outside of that. And some of the queer youth in particular talked about hip-hop artists as being influential in their identity and how they sort of thought about themselves and how they sort of buffered themselves against the homophobia.
There's been a movement afoot, particularly here in the South. We've seen the emergence of Black ministers who are very public in their dissatisfaction of Barack Obama, President Obama, kind of closing ranks around same-sex marriage, you know, to the point that they're actually encouraging, you know, Black voters to stay home from the polls. How has the youth community, particularly community of youth activists, whether in the Bay Area or nationally, responded to President Obama's essentially, you know, saying that he was someone who agreed with same-sex marriage? Is it the kind of issue that, you know, given the kind of lack of excitement around President Obama's candidacy or election, and this time around in comparison to 2008, is it the kind of issue that will get youth activists really to buy on to the campaign this time around with the same levels of energy that we saw 4 years ago?
I think that's a good question, because I don't think same-sex marriage is really sort of the rallying cry of young people. It might be something that as young people of color who are LGBT, they might talk about and maybe reference, but I don't think it's something that directly affects their lives. Like what I learned from the young people was that they were organizing around issues that directly affected them. And though maybe same-sex marriage might sometime in the future affect them if they plan to get married, it wasn't really something that was in the forefront of their discussions around, you know, homophobia and heterosexism and LGBT rights. Like they were talking in some ways, not to sound dramatic, but about survival and what it was like the day-to-day to be an LGBT youth of color who isn't really protected by the discourse around LGBT rights, which is, you know, specifically targeted towards adults and oftentimes towards white people.
Which raises the question about how effective has the Obama presidency been to actually address those on-the-ground issues for youth activists in places like Oakland and other major cities in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is a good question. I don't know if he really has a handle on that sort of on the ground experience. Like same-sex marriage is such a huge thing that sounds really good, but it doesn't really address the everyday lives of people of color, of young people in particular, especially in cities like Oakland, where young people are really still organizing around the deterioration of the educational system here.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Professor Andreana Clay, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at San Francisco State University, the author of the new book, The Hip Hop Generation Fights Back, Youth Activism and Post-Civil Rights Politics, New York University Press. You should have corrected me before this.
It's okay. I'm just happy to be here.
One of the things I kind of wanted to go on as we go forward, one of the things that's great about the book is that you give voice to a generation of activists who won't have access to mainstream media, who most folks won't know by name and obviously won't know them by face. You get to tell their stories and you use them to tell their own stories. What has the reaction been from that community to the publication of the book?
It's been really positive. Like, I'm still in touch with a lot of people that were in the book. I mean, Facebook is a wonderful thing, but also just knowing some of them from the work I've done in Oakland and just seeing them around. And it's been really positive and quite sweet. I just had a book reading at the public library here where I did a lot of work and people came out, and I've been overwhelmed by it.
Mm-hmm. What's next for you, Andreana?
Well, I'm trying to put together a project. I've been doing some papers on Black sexuality and music and Black music, and so I've been putting together something around Nicki Minaj that I'll do at the Women's Studies Association, but working on a second book project around Black performances and queer sexuality. And
you have one of the best pieces that has been written on Michelle Ndegeocello, so I think many of us are excited about this project as we were excited about Hip Hop Generation Fights Back.
Thank you so much. That's great. That's great to hear.
We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Andreana Clay, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at San Francisco State University. She's the author of the brand new book, The Hip Hop Generation Fights Back, Youth Activism and Post-Civil Rights Politics. That's New York University Press. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Professor Clay.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, you know. All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, you know, say. All black everything. All black, you know. All black in the name of all my black